Good morning, everyone. You're listening to the Sci-Files, an exposure segment featuring Michigan State University student research. We're your co-hosts, Chelsie
and Daniel Puentes.
Today we welcome Lauren Cooper. Lauren, may you please introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Lauren Cooper. I am a doctoral student in the Forestry Department, and I also lead the Forest Carbon and Climate Program.
So when I hear forestry, I immediately think of trees. What exactly how does your research involve with trees in the first place?
So there's a lot of disciplines in the Forestry Department. We range from very physical science to more on the social science side of things. I'm more on the social science side, so I'm really interested in policies, stakeholder engagement, education. A big part of my work is a lot in translating some of the physical science into shaping decision making.
What kind of physical science do you shape for these policy implementations?
So we know that forests, we're probably all aware that forests have an increasingly important part of the conversation about climate change. So my work is really bridging the gap between what we know physically about climate change and how the forests interact with the atmosphere and store carbon, which is part of CO2, which warms our climate, and translating that into people that make decisions about forests. So whether it's forest management, how to manage forests that we use for timber, or conserving forests, and then particularly for my research, I work with communities in Peru and Ecuador that make decisions communally about forests in their territories.
Well, that just happens to coincide near the region where the Amazon rainforest fire is currently happening right now.
We've been talking for decades now about how important the Amazon is, and issues with Brazil and deforestation have been going for a long time. These forest fires are not actually quite as much of an anomaly as maybe they're being made out to seem in the media right now. Like the pressures and the issues that are going on there have been going on for a long time. But I think it's really good and positive that they're getting a lot of attention and as much attention as they're getting. The problem fundamentally is that there's a lot of development pressures and globalization, access to global markets. So it's basically soy and cattle that's driving deforestation there. But the problem is that once the rainforest becomes destabilized and degraded, the ecosystem actually kind of changes and becomes more vulnerable. So now it's the dry season, and so some of the clearing and the fires that would have been done in the past as well are becoming more dangerous and can get out of control, similar to what we've seen in the United States as well, where you have changing conditions and drying conditions. And so this is where a lot of my work comes in, is kind of differentiating sometimes what are natural cycles and then how these issues can become even more complicated and dangerous with a changing climate.
Then do you think what's going on with the Amazon rainforest is a natural thing that's occurring?
No, it's definitely from people that are clearing the landscape, first of all. So there's expanding agriculture in these areas, and then they're using fire to clear the landscape. And sometimes fire is used both on an annual clearing of litter to kind of speed up the decomposition process and clear area, but it's also used to clear new areas of forest. And there's just been, they've had a change in leadership in Brazil that a lot of people are pointing to as a shift in policies and kind of re-upping encouragement of agricultural practices, which I think there's a lot of research is happening right now trying to understand how tightly the changes in policies are a direct cause of the current forest fires, because it hasn't been a huge amount of time since this new leadership has taken place. So it's not clear how directly it's causing this, or if this is more coincidental from activities that have been taking place over recent decades.
Great. And then how does your Ph.D. play a role in a much more general setting when it comes to informing the policies that legislators need to be aware of in regards to forestry research?
So that's a good question, and that's something that really motivates me in my work. So it's important to understand that the land ownership system in these countries is very different than in the United States in many areas. Brazil also has a lot of private ownership. And I'm not as knowledgeable about Brazil, which is a huge and complex country. But the land management and the forest deforestation pressures are very similar, actually, between Peru and Ecuador and Brazil. It's a lot of increasing agricultural pressures, and it comes up against communally held land in all of these countries. And in places like Brazil, or for certain, Peru and Ecuador, understanding communally held land is really important, because actually in Peru, 70% of the rainforest is held by communal landholders. So understanding their decision making, what's important to them, is fundamentally important to conserving the Amazon forest. And I know that issues, we're seeing it in the news right now with Brazil. There's a lot of pushback from indigenous communities that are deeply concerned, and rightly so, about oncoming pressure and sometimes violent interactions with those that want to deforest and to be able to undertake other activities, whether it's mining, or agriculture. So my work is really, I'm really interested in the communities, but I'm less on like a truly anthropological side of things, where I'm not, my work is not as deeply embedded in really understanding everything about communities. I'm more focusing on incentives, so policy incentives, and so whether that's what we call a payment for ecosystem service program or other sort of payment, and how that's perceived by communities. And what is the appropriate level and type of incentive? Sometimes it's not cash payment. It can be other types of incentives, like capacity building or training, or other services that they would like. But making sure it's the appropriate type of incentive, and it's the appropriate amount of incentive, to make sure that those communities are also participating in reducing deforestation, because a lot of people out there don't have many livelihood options. And so when they have the opportunity to participate in agriculture, for example, it may seem like the only option for them to get access to the cash economy. So my work is really looking at how can we communicate and support what we call both human development and conservation efforts in these areas through incentives, and how can we then communicate that to policymakers? So understanding what are values in the communities, and then what do the policymakers need to know about that.
When communicating this, do you go to Peru to actually talk to them, or do you go to DC, or do you do everything remotely over here at Michigan State?
That's a good question. I do a lot of my work regularly. I am in DC regularly, but I do go to Peru. So I am focused on Peru. There's a particular program there that I'm researching. It's called it's a TDC for short, but it's the Direct Transfer Program that's in place right now in Peru, and it's paying communities to not deforest. But it's sort of like a policy experiment, you could think of, because you think of it this way, because they're not really, they're implementing it, but now is the time to start assessing how is it working, what do people think about it, if they could sign up for it again, or for like indefinitely for whatever many years. Would they sign up again? So it's a good opportunity to start exploring, or start better understanding how this particular program is actually shaping decision making there. And there's similar programs in other countries. There's one in Ecuador, for example. So these countries are kind of looking at one another and trying to figure out if we want to make a long-term plan to both reduce poverty in these areas and conserve the rainforest. How do we actually do that?
In your research, how do you overcome the cultural barrier that exists between you and I'm not sure, are you dealing with indigenous South American people, or are you dealing with Spanish-speaking people?
I deal with both. My work, so part of my research is also exploring the policies themselves. So I'm also interested in the kind of process that the policymakers are going through to make these policies. A lot of times it's influenced by large international grants. And so I'm kind of tracking also the influence, what's shaping their decision making. So for example, there's a lot of really interesting work in climate and forests, and they throw around terms like gender and equity in the international space, and they all speak all these with all this jargon. But how is that really being interpreted at the country level? And then how are those policies that they're making actually playing out on the ground? Are those ideas about gender and equity and inclusion actually happening? So I'm interested in this kind of policymaking space as well. So I do spend a lot of time in Lima. So I spend time like in the Ministry of the Environment, but I'm also partnering with various nonprofit, which we call NGOs, non-governmental organizations in the international space. So to overcome the cultural barrier, I usually like to rely on programs that already have relationships in the communities. It's pretty hard to just show up and march into a community and get somewhere somewhat quickly. So, and I think one thing that's really important is to not go through the government for that, because sometimes communities don't have just something about being from the government can not necessarily open doors or have a very frank and open conversation. But these nonprofits that have been working with communities to maybe so, for example, I'm working with one that has been working with communities to improve their agricultural practices, to make them more efficient, help them access markets. Their goal is to reduce forest pressure, or deforestation, by reducing the pressure to take more land. So if they can make more money from the same hectares of cacao or for chocolate, for example, then that, in theory, would help them not have to keep cutting down more rainforest. So working through those nonprofits that are in these communities, I'm better able to go and visit and get introduced through people that they already trust.
It seems like you work with a lot of non-government organizations, NGOs. It seems like you work with a lot of nonprofits, but also government entities as well. How do you organize or prioritize which ones to work with? Because you have a lot of options.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I struggle with that. I think a little bit trying to determine the right scale to look at, because there's certainly entire PhDs you could do looking strictly at the role of the nonprofit sector or how the government works. I've chosen to take kind of in some ways, sort of a macro approach. So in my research, I'm looking at both kind of the high level of like influence and decision making that's informing these projects. And then we're also developing a survey instrument that we will issue within the communities to capture perceptions there as well. So, I recognize the challenge in really fully diving into these different actor types, but I'm looking at a kind of a larger narrative of decision making and flows of funding, and how that's ultimately attempting to incentivize and change behavior. So I fundamentally have to look across these multiple actors, and there are trade-offs, I guess, as far as granularity of your findings and but my goal is more so to capture a bigger picture of what's happening on the landscape.
Well, this is a really complex and comprehensive PhD project that you're working on here, and thanks for the explanation and a little bit of insight. But what motivated you to get involved with this project in the first place?
So I've actually been at Michigan State for 5 years now. I started as an academic specialist, and that's still what I kind of jokingly call my day job. I was working in Peru when I accepted this position. I'm from Michigan originally. I'm from Detroit. So it was homecoming for me, and the timing was right for me to do that. And when I came back, I was really excited to take on this role as a specialist, and I have developed and led the Forest, Carbon, and Climate program in the Forestry Department. And this started from a graduate certificate that had initiated before my time here, but we grew it beyond that, and now we're also we have a series of professional development opportunities in it's mostly online training. So we just launched a 6 to 8 week professional development short course, and it's all on forest, carbon, and climate topics. But then after being here for a number of years, I realized that I really liked the research and the teaching opportunities as well, and I got really motivated to think about going back to school and pursuing a PhD. And it's been a really good fit in the department. There's a lot of overlap between my interests in the Forest, Carbon, and Climate program and this international space. And it's just really nice timing because we're really established now domestically, And it seems like the timing is right to start expanding our influence internationally. And so I'm tying that really closely with my doctoral work.
Is there a difference between the Department of Forestry at MSU and the Department of Forest, Carbon, and Climate? I can't remember the exact name. Can you repeat that, please?
Yeah, I direct the Forest, Carbon, and Climate program. So we are a program in the Department of Forestry. We currently have a number of activities. We do both formal education and non-formal education. So our formal education is a graduate certificate. It's graduate level courses online. There's 3 of them. And so we get people from all over the world that get involved in the graduate certificate. For non-formal education, we have some professional development short courses. So we have one offered on a partners e-learning platform, which is the Society of American Foresters. We have a new short course on our own platform, so it's on D2L, and we have various people. It's largely people from the United States, but from a lot of state governments that are starting to look at how can their forests and their forest inventories contribute to whether possibly state or local level climate policies. So, for example, Michigan just joined the Climate Alliance, which is now 24 states that have agreed to uphold the Paris Agreement. And all of these states have governors' offices and people from their Department of Natural Resources that are looking at carbon and inventories. And they just frankly didn't learn about carbon management in school, most of them. So we create really beautiful training, really interactive online learning experiences, and we host people through that. And then we also do a number of stakeholder engagement and outreach activities. So I'm headed to a workshop with the U.S. Forest Service on Wednesday in Atlanta, and we also host a monthly webinar series. So anyway, there's a lot of stuff on our website if you want to see what we're up to.
We'll make sure to post it on our description of the episode whenever the podcast gets uploaded online.
Someone asked Daniel and I a few days ago that I feel like you might be better qualified to answer is how can people, just like the general people, anyone out there, decrease their carbon footprint and live a more green lifestyle?
Yeah, because we find a lot of times people rag on each other for sharing a post about the Amazon rainforest fire, but then they're like, oh, you're not really doing anything to help. So how can people make a difference in their everyday lives?
Oh, this is a big question. I think it is frustrating as individuals because we know there's these big issues, and it's hard to think that what we can do as individuals makes much of a difference. The unfortunate reality is it probably doesn't make that much of a difference as your individual decision making. So recycling, all of these things are great, but there's so many people that your individual impact is not necessarily going to stop climate change. There's individual activities you can do, but I think that there's also larger policy mechanisms that we need to be striving for. We know about, for example, issues with plastics. And one individual declining a straw is not going to necessarily make a big difference, but I think as a society, we need to start thinking differently about how we use these types of materials. And unfortunately, you end up getting into kind of a political discussion pretty quickly about really needing to have policies that make these decisions for us. With the right leadership, you can have some really big policy nudges that end up making a really big difference quickly. For example, we have a deposit in the state of Michigan, and we have some of the highest rates of aluminum of can and bottle recycling in the country because we have a deposit. So sometimes policy mechanisms are where you can really get big changes. But I don't think people should be disheartened because there are things that you can do as an individual. I just sometimes think that I kind of agree sometimes that thinking that just because you recycle, but then you're not paying attention to who's in office and who's actually making laws about you and materials and these types of things is also a kind of a missed opportunity. So if you really want to engage on these topics, you have to pay attention to what companies are doing and what your government's doing, even what your state, your local government's doing. Speaking up right now in Lansing, they're making decisions about power plants and roads, advocating for bike lanes. So there's, I think, a lot of, it's not just riding your bike, it's also advocating for bike lanes and speaking up and being a little bit more present and communicating what you want to see, both in your immediate environment and at the next level. So as much as I think that's a good example. As much as I think, yeah, I'm good for me, I'm riding my bike, I also made sure to email the mayor's office and make sure that they put wider bike lanes on the new Mount Hope road, because I want people to feel safe biking on there. So I think there's a mix of being individually responsible and then also contributing to a larger voice and making sure that you actually vote for people that you think are going to work towards protecting your environment, and putting policies in place that are actually moving us forward.
Before we entered the studio, you mentioned that you have 2 children. What is it like being a mother and an academic specialist and a PhD student?
Yeah, it's kind of intense right now. I'm lucky to have a partner that we share a lot of duties, and we trade off the flow of things that need to be done in our household. But I will say I'm super grateful to have the type of work that I have. So I can squeeze in flexible hours. I can switch up my day as needed. And so, yeah, I mean, frankly, it is challenging. This is, I'll tell myself this is just an intense part of my life. I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. But I think I just rely on the fact that I really enjoy both my work and what I'm researching. So I'm really inspired by the things that I look at, by the people I talk to. I love the opportunity to travel. So even though it's hard to be away from my family sometimes for up to like a week and a half is about as long as I can go. But I love doing it. I love advancing my language skills, and I'm getting really excited about the contribution I can make in this field. And I'm seeing that my research questions are unique, and so I'm really motivated to keep going. And a little self-care and making sure I get enough sleep goes a long way.
What advice would you give to other graduate students that are currently parents as well, that feel like they're struggling and don't know what to do?
Well, I mean, I think my number one thing really is communicating with my partner about what needs to get done, and having the trade-offs, and sharing those responsibilities really evenly, so that if there's an imbalance there, then it could really add a lot of stress on one person unfairly. So that would maybe be something to check first. And then if you don't have family, or you don't have a network, another thing would be to build that out. There's a lot of other families and people that would be happy to do some sort of sharing or trade-offs with kids for free if you can work it out, so you can make sure you get some free time. And also if you just don't have any of that bandwidth, it's also okay to back off from some of the pressure and some of the activities. I mean, everything is a trade-off, and we can only do what we can do, and it's not worth taking away your enjoyment of your children and your everyday by just trying to meet too many demands. So, sometimes it's okay to slow it down a year, or take the pressure off in another way, or switch up your schedule so you have a little more time at home during the day if you need to. And so maybe that could be a question to talk to your supervisor about, or work from home some other days. So there's a lot of little things that I do that help me cope and get a lot done, that by building in a little more flexibility when I need it.
Thanks a lot for those words of wisdom, and also taking the time out of your busy schedule to come join us this morning in the studio.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you to all of our listeners that joined us this week. And remember, the truth is in the science. Any comments and questions can be directed to Sci-Files at impact89fm.org. We'll see you all next week on Sci-Files.